Hey guys, the real Mr. Robinson here. Welcome back to part 3 of my chronological recap of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And today, it's Iron Man, the one that started it all. It came out in 2008, stars Robert Downey Jr., Jeff Bridges, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Don Cheadle. Oh wait, no, it stars Terrence Howard as James Rhodes. Wow, I've gotten so used to Don Cheadle in that role. But anyway, this is the movie that again, started it all. It was the very first film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe when these movies were being distributed by Paramount, not Disney, because by this point, this movie came out just 2 years before Disney ended up buying Marvel Comics. This movie is actually very interesting for when it came out and looking back on it today. When it first came out, I was actually not excited for it because I wasn't a huge fan of comic book movies, to be honest. I liked the Spider-Man movies because I'm a big Spider-Man guy, but I never actually loved them. Even back then when Spider-Man 2 came out, I was like, this is good. This is very good, but I'm not quite in love with it. And then most of the comic book movies I'd seen in the modern era before this movie came out were bland. For example, Ang Lee's Hulk, I don't even remember all that much. I just remember it being kind of an ugly mess. I didn't like Daredevil at all. The two Fantastic Four movies were horrible. And it's also funny that Iron Man would come out a year after probably the worst year for comic book movies, 2007, because you had Ghost Rider, Spider-Man 3, which I still don't think is awful, but definitely a huge disappointment, and Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer. And with those three movies, I was like, I never need to see another comic book movie in my life. And then this movie came out, and I was like, whoa, this is awesome. This is what I like to see in these kinds of movies. And this was also a big shift in the genre with this and The Dark Knight, where people started taking comic book movies a lot more seriously. And then it wasn't until the Avengers where the entire genre changed forever. But let's talk about Iron Man, because back then, I loved it. I included it as one of my top 40 favorite movies of all time. And rewatching this movie again in prep for this review, I still like it. But it actually was a while since I've seen this. The last time I saw this movie was prepping for Captain America: Civil War, because, you know, Tony versus Steve. And the beginning of this movie is kind of interesting, because it has some elements that really date the movie, because the opening scene, which by the way is the best possible introduction for Tony Stark, but the opening scene is where he's in the back of a Humvee with 3 soldiers holding a glass of scotch, and they're listening to AC/DC's Back in Black, which is a band that just fits Iron Man and Tony Stark perfectly. But they're listening to it on an old boombox that has a CD player. I'm like, wow, 11 years later, that thing looks really outdated. Then one of the soldiers asks Tony Stark if it's okay if he takes a picture, and Tony Stark, when they're posing, says, I don't want to see this on your MySpace page. And I'm like, wow, MySpace, that's an outdated reference. Now let's actually dive into Tony Stark, because the way I'm doing these videos is I'm going by categories, starting with the hero, villain, supporting cast, action, stingers, connections to other movies. So I'll definitely be doing categories for all these videos to come. This was perfect casting in the works. Like, this right here, Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark, is one of those true lightning in a bottle things, like with Christopher Reeve as Superman. And this was also the movie that put Robert Downey Jr. back on the map, because back then, people make fun of him for his drug problems, alcohol problems, having problems with being in jail. And for me, who's never even heard of Iron Man or knows Tony Stark's story, they did a damn good job of really nailing it in this movie, where Tony Stark is pretty much a billionaire playboy philanthropist whose company designs weapons, but he finds himself in a situation where his weapons are being used against the people he's trying to help. So he gets captured, tortured, forced to build weapons, and he manages to get out because he builds an Iron Man suit. And it's funny that the terrorists have cameras in his cave with the scientist that he's working with, Jensen, and they're just way too late to catch on to that fact. And then when he actually breaks out, he decides that his company's no longer going to develop weapons and he's going to do humanitarian things. And it's a great redemption story. Tony Stark has self-guilt after learning the horrors of what his weapons have caused to millions of innocent people. So basically, he does a 180 and decides to take on the persona of Iron Man to try to maintain the peace in a more positive light. And with this being the 3rd movie in chronological order, I could tell you right now that if you're watching the MCU for the first time, it's not a good idea to start in chronological order, because Iron Man is probably the most grounded of all the MCU movies, even over something like Captain America the Winter Soldier, because if you start this series with the first Avenger, it's a World War II movie, sure, but it has science fiction elements to it. Captain Marvel is just straight out science fiction with aliens, shapeshifters, and plus you'll gain a lot more from that movie if you've seen the others beforehand. And then you go to this movie, which is, by comparison, very tame, and it's a real cool glimpse into the past of where this series actually started, and how it's really embraced its comic book roots and became something super out there. Now let's talk about the villain with Jeff Bridges, because I don't think I've ever heard people talk about Jeff Bridges that much in this movie. And people usually say that the MCU does have a villain problem, which I think they've improved on, even though I didn't think Jan Rog was a very good villain in Captain Marvel. But I will say this about Jeff Bridges. Similar to Jude Law in Captain Marvel, he is really good in the movie. Jeff Bridges is damn good in this movie. But in terms of like a villain and his motivation, kind of weak, because when you get right down to it, Obadiah Stane does the stuff that he's doing to pretty much overthrow Tony Stark and regain control of Stark Industries, which I'm like, really? Like, it all boils down to corporate decisions? Okay, I guess. I mean, still, Jeff Bridges does a really good job. And even though Jeff Bridges has been a long-established actor beforehand, with Tron, The Big Lebowski, this movie came out 2 years before he did True Grit, and I feel like ever since True Grit, he's had to take movies where you're talking like this, and you're calling mumbles a lot, it's talking like this with southern accent, So with his role as Obadiah Stane in Iron Man, he's really good, and he's actually normal by comparison with all the roles that he does afterwards. So definitely not one of the strongest villains in the MCU, but a good performance nonetheless. And in terms of your supporting cast, Gwyneth Paltrow plays Pepper Potts, who is Tony Stark's assistant. She's good in this movie, and even though she's supposedly Tony Stark's love interest in this movie, I do like how they're just subtle hints. They never really take it all the way. They're very professional towards each other, and while it has a will they or won't they feel to it, it doesn't get resolved. It kind of is left open-ended, at least until the sequel comes out. So she's fun, and I've grown to like the relationship that these two characters have developed as the series goes on. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room with Terrence Howard, because in this first movie, James Rhodes is played by Terrence Howard, who, as you know, that character ends up becoming War Machine, and I'm curious what the rest of the series would have been like if Terrence Howard had stuck around, because he's pretty good in this role. Although I gotta be honest, for some strange reason, it's hard for me to imagine Terrence Howard in the War Machine armor. I think part of that has to do with the fact that we never saw him in the armor. The character never actually gets the armor until Iron Man 2. But for some reason, Don Cheadle just looks like he fits that armor better. Like, he looks so much cooler in that armor than I think Terrence Howard would have. But for what it's worth in this movie, Terrence Howard does a very good job. He is very much the straight man next to Tony Stark, who in the beginning of this movie is just completely egotistical, full of himself. And it's nice to see the bond between these two friends grow as Tony Stark tries to lean more towards humanitarian stuff. But still, I think I prefer Don Cheadle as this character more than I do Terrence Howard. The humor is great, and when this movie first came out, for me it was a breath of fresh air, because with these comic book movies, I'd always imagined them as more serious, like Spider-Man, Daredevil, or Hulk, and whenever these movies tried to lean more towards comedy, like the two Fantastic Four movies, they were just terrible. So this movie being as humorous as it is, and working to its advantage, is a relief, really. There are some great moments in this movie that made me laugh hard. The one line in this movie that had me laughing hysterically, along with the entire audience, is the scene after Tony Stark gets back from the Middle East to destroy his weapons, and Pepper Potts walks in on him as he's getting out of the Iron Man suit. There's this pause where they just look at each other, and Tony Stark just says, "Let's face it, this is not the worst thing you've caught me doing." And even with rewatching this movie, that line still gets me every time. But it's actually not as funny as the rest of the series would end up becoming later on. But you know what? It's actually not supposed to be laugh out loud funny. It has those humorous moments, and Tony Stark is more of an upbeat character, but he's also got a very dark origin story, and there are some dark bits with this character. that really leads into some good drama. Seeing Tony Stark change throughout this movie is really engaging, and you buy into the drama and the dynamic he has with all the supporting cast. And like with the first Avenger, it just leads into one of the best origin movies out there. And one of the pivotal moments that really works is when he and the scientist Jensen are working in the cave to get out. And that's when Tony Stark really starts to learn more humanity when working with this guy. And the actor who plays Jensen, Shaun Toub, really reminds me of Stanley Tucci in the first Avenger. And with both Jensen and Erskine, you look at these characters and you go, they're so likable and they serve as such great mentors to our main characters. I hope nothing bad happens to them. Something does happen to both of them, but those scenes work. The action is exciting, the CGI on the Iron Man suit is good, and there's also some really great practical work by Stan Winston. This was one of the very last movies that Stan Winston worked on while he was alive, and the breakout scene with the Mark I Iron Man suit, it's mostly a real suit. You look at that and go, there is somebody inside that suit, and it is awesome. The Iron Man suit in general is just so badass. I remember when I first saw this movie and that thing goes flying around. Once it's actually in the Mark III phase, it was the coolest thing ever. I wanted it, and for some reason the big thing that really stuck out to me was the fact that it could accept cell phone calls. I don't know why that moment stuck out to me, but I was like, I need that suit now. Now I will say this about the movie. I love this movie, regardless. But one particular issue I have with the movie is that the ending of the movie, the big climactic battle, is very anticlimactic. It's just Tony Stark and Obadiah Stane in the Ironmonger suit going at it, and it just doesn't feel as grand as it could have been. But then again, this is kind of a personal story. The end of the world is not at stake, so there's no real huge stakes. But watching the battle, there were just moments where I'm like, oh, that's it? Well, still, really good movie in the end. And the ending of the movie was one of those moments where it's like, we are entering a new era in comic book movies. Because one of the things that I've always been accustomed to, even in the comics, I'm pretty sure that Tony Stark kept his secret identity safe before this movie came out. And that was the nature of these superheroes. You had to keep your secret identity safe to protect those around you that are close to you in your life. But with the very last line of the movie before credits roll, when Tony Stark says to the world, I am Iron Man, like my jaw dropped, like, no, you're not supposed to do that! Then just cuts to credits, and I'm like, wow, this movie is awesome. So many great surprises, a great leading character, great supporting cast, cool action, despite an anticlimactic final battle. This is awesome. I still love this movie even 11 years later, so get off your ass and go see it right now, just because it's Iron Man. It's that good. And then the end credit scene of the movie is the one that officially put us on this path to something even greater. Now, this end credit scene I actually never saw until I got the movie on DVD. But I would just love to go back in time, stay at the end of the credits to see what the first reactions are to this scene where Nick Fury, played by Samuel L. Jackson, is in Tony Stark's apartment telling him that he's a part of a bigger universe and he just doesn't know it. And especially the moment when he tells Tony, I'm here to talk to you about the Avengers initiative. I just want to be in that theater opening night to hear the entire crowd lose their minds at that idea. Now, I'll say this, in terms of chronological order, even though we now know that Nick Fury got his eye scratched out by an alien cat, he's still a badass. I still love Nick Fury, and Samuel L. Jackson is just, he was pitch perfect for that role. So there you go, that's Iron Man. Before I take off, I want to mention the Stan Lee cameos, because they're truly an important part to every Marvel movie, and I forgot to mention them for the last two. In Captain America: The First Avenger, there's a press conference after Steve has just saved the entire 107th from Johann Schmidt's grasp, and they're about to present an award to him, but he's not there, and Stan Lee's just a military officer who thinks that some guy coming out is Steve Rogers, and he goes to the guy next to him and says, I thought he'd be taller. And then in Captain Marvel, Stan Lee is basically going over his lines for Mallrats, the Kevin Smith movie. Carol just tips the page down, Stan Lee smiles, and then Carol smiles back at him, knowing that he's not a Skrull. And then in this one, Tony Stark confuses Stan Lee with Hugh Hefner because he's wearing the robe, and it's just a funny cameo. I love Stan Lee's cameos in this movie. I'm going to make it a priority to point everyone out. But yeah, that's Iron Man. Tune in a couple days from now where I'm going to talk about its sequel, Iron Man 2. I know technically The Incredible Hulk came out next, but given that Iron Man 2 takes place 6 months after the first Iron Man, I think it's probably better to tackle this one next. So yeah, until Iron Man 2, I want to know what your guys' thoughts are on Iron Man. Do you still love it? Does it seem very outdated? What's your opinion on it overall now that the series has just evolved to this out-of-this-world level? Let me know in the comments below. And until next time, I hope you enjoyed this review. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and of course leave a comment. Don't forget to support my Patreon page, follow me on social media, and until next time, this is the Real Mr. Robinson telling you, there's only one.